Hello, everyone. This week we're talking about the Zhuangzi, and Scully is very excited to tell you about it.
There's a talking skull.
That's right, there is a talking skull in the Zhuangzi. It is a wild and bizarre text full of strange anecdotes and parables. Probably the most famous is the story of the man who wakes from dreaming that he was a butterfly and isn't sure that maybe he's not a butterfly now, dreaming that he's a man. But we'll also encounter a man who expects his left arm to sprout into a rooster. We'll encounter a man who's banging on a tub and singing after his wife dies. And yes, we will encounter
A
a
talking
talking
skull.
skull. The theme of transformation is absolutely central to the Zhuangzi, and he presents death as one transformation among many. All of these parables suggest that transformation isn't something to be feared, but something to be celebrated.
But the talking skull is the best part.
The Zhuangzi is one of the weirdest and most wonderful texts in world philosophy. It presents the teaching of Zhuangzi, who was a sage in late 4th century BCE China, and is taken to be one of the foundational texts of Taoism. But we need to be careful about how we use that term, that Taoism as a philosophical school or philosophical movement arose much later. So it's not that Zhuangzi himself saw himself as a Taoist, but rather later Taoists appropriated the Zhuangzi as one of their foundational texts. The other major foundational text in Taoism from that classical Chinese period is the Tao Te Ching, which is much more famous than the Zhuangzi. The Tao Te Ching apparently is the third most translated text in the world after the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita. And what you get in the Tao Te Ching is a sort of poetic expression of a mystical vision that can be quite moving and quite beautiful. Zhuangzi also has a mystical vision that has many things in common with the Tao Te Ching, in particular this idea that we need to stop trying to force certain outcomes, but rather kind of go with the flow, to accept ourselves as part of a flow of nature where the ideal is not one of action, but rather one of non-action or wu wei. But in the Zhuangzi, rather than finding mystical poetry, you find a bizarre collection of anecdotes and jokes and parables that are often quite funny, very riotous and wild. There's a lot of humor, there's a lot of uh, joking around, that sort of thing. And it makes for an electrifying, if sometimes baffling, read. One of the central themes of the Zhuangzi is transformation. So, for example, in the first chapter, sometimes translated as something like free and easy wandering, you have a series of anecdotes of mythical creatures traveling around the world, changing in size, changing into other things, and that sort of sets a tone, you might say, for the text that follows, where we're constantly told that one thing changes into another, which changes into another. We have various stories about dreams, the most famous being the butterfly dream, where the man wakes from dreaming he's a butterfly and wonders if he's a butterfly dreaming he's a man. But throughout, we have this idea that everything is subject to change, everything is constantly in flux. And I think it's worth emphasizing that this idea of transformation goes a lot deeper than just saying stuff changes. So, I mean, we can all agree that stuff changes. But the common way of thinking about change is to think of change as something that happens to objects that have some kind of underlying stable essence. So, in the Western philosophical tradition, you have this idea of substances with various accidental properties. That the piece of wax can start out as hard and odorless, but it can be heated and become scented and soft. But there's this underlying thing, namely wax, which is the thing that undergoes change. What it means to undergo change is for something to change from one state to another. And we find that even in modern science, the idea that wax has a certain set of chemical properties. The piece of wax will have the same atoms in the same sort of structure, but maybe when you melt the wax, the relationship between the atoms becomes a bit more fluid or whatever else. They maybe release scents or whatever, but there's sort of an underlying chemical structure that remains unchanged even as things change. And I think what's radical about the Zhuangzi is the idea that we're not just talking about change over a bedrock of stability, but rather change all the way down. Maybe one way to think about this metaphor is to say that, if the traditional conception of change is one where there's sort of a series of changes happening on top of a bedrock of stability, Zhuangzi is saying, well, I mean, if he were a geologist, he might say something like, well, all bedrock is sitting upon a sea of molten lava, that underneath the bedrock, there is something fluid and constantly changing. And in this regard, his closest ally in the Western tradition may be the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus, who also emphasizes the idea of constant change, constant flux, as the underlying feature of reality. Now, this conception of flux, of transformation, of change, has some interesting philosophical implications. So, some of them are epistemological. They deal with knowledge, that typically we think of knowledge as knowledge of stable objects that we can know about. But if everything is constantly changing, then what we can claim to know lacks that kind of stability. And there are a number of moments, a lot of the funny moments in the Zhuangzi involve a kind of undermining of the idea that we might have any claim to stable or secure knowledge. But significantly, for the purposes of thinking about death, another element of this conception of transformation concerns the nature of the self, that what I am as a person is something that is constantly subject to change and to transformation. And that then feeds into a certain way of thinking about death. And the theme of death is one that comes up a lot in the Zhuangzi. We see a lot of discussions of death. And death is typically presented as just one more transformation among others. That I have this human form for now, and then when I die, I'll take on some other form. And so there's a sense of, first of all, death not being some kind of cataclysmic break where who I am is annihilated, because if the self is not some stable entity that can die, then there's nothing radically transformative about the idea of death, but also a notion of acceptance of death as one transformation among many. And to the extent that we live in a world of transformations, the wise person accepts these transformations. They roll along with them. They move from one change to another. And that means that they also accept their mortality as part of this process of transformation. And they would regard any kind of resistance to death as a resistance to the way that things are. So I might give you a couple of accounts of how death figures in anecdotes in the Zhuangzi, just to give you some flavor of how it's presented. One involves Zhuangzi coming across a skull and asking it a series of questions, saying, "Oh, what happened to you that you got into this state?" And then he falls asleep, and in the night, the skull comes to him in a dream and has a conversation where the skull tells him, "You're asking all the wrong questions. You think something bad happened to me that I turned into a skull? I couldn't be happier. That now that I'm a skull, I'm free from all of the worries, all of the burdens, all of the responsibilities of life. If I could be a king in the world, I would choose not to. I would prefer just to be dead." And there's a number of features about the story that I think are interesting. First of all, the fact that there's a skull talking to him is kind of part of the weird, kind of morbid, dark humor that you find in the Zhuangzi, this figure of a skull who's able to have a conversation with the sage. But also this idea that being dead is preferable to being alive. There's I think, an interesting contrast here with the Odyssey by Homer, where Odysseus goes into the underworld and encounters Achilles, who says he would rather be an ordinary peasant on earth than king of all the dead. And here we get a reversal of that, saying the skull would rather be dead than be king of all the world. And the thought there is that what's difficult about life is you have all these impediments to going along with things. You're living in a world where there are responsibilities, there's duties, there's burdens, and death is a kind of liberation from that. And the skull is celebrating that. That said, being dead is not presented as simply a good thing. Two anecdotes show this. One, Zhuangzi passes the grave of Huizi, and Huizi is a figure who's often the fall guy in a lot of the Zhuangzi anecdotes. He's the one speaking up for common sense, and Zhuangzi is the one who then playfully undermines the things that Huizi says. And then Zhuangzi sees his grave and says, since he died, I haven't had anybody to sharpen my wit against. And so there is an appreciation, first of all, quite a sweet appreciation for Huizi, who's often a figure of fun in the text, but also an acknowledgement that there's something that Zhuangzi has lost in losing Huizi. Maybe more strikingly, and perhaps the most famous anecdote about death in the Zhuangzi concerns Zhuangzi's wife, who dies. And Huizi happens upon Zhuangzi shortly after his wife has died and sees Zhuangzi sitting there banging on a tub and singing. And Huizi finds this very inappropriate, that Zhuangzi is having a grand old time after his wife has died. And Zhuangzi says, well, when she first died, of course I cried a little. But then I thought, there were a series of transformations that brought her into being, and there's been another series of transformations that have taken her away. And And that's just the way of things. And there's a couple of features of that story that I quite like. One is, again, that acknowledgement that even Zhuangzi had a bit of a sad moment when his wife died. It's not that he's saying that death is just fine, no problem, doesn't bother me at all. But also, there's a sense that the transformations are part of what he cherishes. He can't cherish his wife without cherishing the changes that she was. And some of those changes involve death. And if he can't celebrate her death, then in some sense he isn't celebrating her life. And the singing and the banging on the washtub, I think, is meant to be a kind of a parody of traditional funeral rites. And so the suggestion there is that Zhuangzi is having a funeral of a kind, but it's a funeral that is a celebration rather than one that is marked by grief and mourning. And the last anecdote I'll share with you involves Zhuangzi's death himself. So Zhuangzi is ready to die, his followers are gathered all around, and he says, everything's ready, I'm ready to go. And they say, shouldn't we bury you? Otherwise the ravens and the other birds are going to eat you. And Zhuangzi says, well, look, if you put me under the earth, the bugs in the earth are going to eat me. So why are you showing such favoritism to the bugs in the earth over the birds in the sky? And there's, first of all, I think, a sort of a fairly relaxed attitude about his own mortality there. But also, again, this idea of transformation being everywhere, and that there isn't a better or worse, there's just different kinds of transformation. Why are we showing any preference to the bugs in the earth over the birds in the sky? So throughout the Zhuangzi, we get the sense that death is a transformation. And it's a transformation that if we see things rightly, we accept because we accept the world as one is marked by transformation. And the way to a happy and contented life is one that involves accepting and going along with this constant flux of change rather than trying to resist it or trying to control it. If you liked this video,
Or if you like talking skulls,
do please consider giving it a thumbs up on YouTube, or maybe even consider following this YouTube channel. Scully and I would really appreciate it.